this is it. It's the end of the line for me. But not for you. Fast is what you do best, ain't it? Just keep running.
Don't get too close!
Explode!
Good work!
This video is incredibly long and I really do not want to waste any time, so I'm going to give a quick rundown of the events of JJK Zero so we're all on the same page. If you have seen or watched this recently, you can skip ahead to the next chapter. Okay, love you. Yuta, who is a 15 to 16-year-old, is transferred to Jujutsu High after the cursed spirit of his childhood friend Rika, who died in a traffic collision, maims his classmates. Here, he meets Gojo, his instructor, and his classmates Panda, Maki, and Inumaki. While on assignment with Maki, Yuta reveals that he's a pathetic pushover with no conviction. After the two are ambushed by a big curse, Maki gives a speech about taking action, and Yuta says he wants to stop running away and feel like he can be relied on. He then activates Rika, and she claws her way out, with Yuta taking Maki to safety. After this, Yuta resolves to free Rika. 3 months later, Yuta is training with the sword after Gojo instructs him that he can channel Rika through the sword, and that will be slowly working on unraveling the cursed energy so he can finally free Rika. He and Inumaki are sent to a mall and exercise low-level curses, but are ambushed by a grade 1. Yuta, too weak to do anything, dodges around to get Inumaki's plot device so Inumaki can be the one to defeat the curse. Here, Yuta learns basic compassion as he wants to help Inumaki because Inumaki protected him. Geto is here as well. Chapter 3, we properly meet Geto, who's collecting curses at his cult for world domination. He meets with his cronies and flies to Jujutsu High to throw his glove and declare war, while explicitly trying to recruit Yuta. The school then scrambles, deciding it's total warfare, and it mobilizes to Tokyo and Kyoto on Christmas Eve 2017 to intercept Geto's night parade of 1,000 demons. Now, Yuta is incapable of safely using Rika, so he stays behind alongside Maki as she herself is not a sorcerer. They have a bonding moment where Yuta sees Maki as aspirational, but suddenly Geto attacks. Maki goes to fight him and loses. Gojo on the front lines gets information that causes him to send Panda and Inumaki to fight Geto, and they lose. Then, Yuta sees the carnage, has a mental break, and through the sheer power of love, activates Rika. Together, they are able to defeat Geto. Sometime later, presumably in the morning, Gojo shows up to finish off Geto and reveals to Yuta and the crew that the reason Rika exists is that as a child, Yuta cursed her. This is possible because it's also revealed he is related to a strong sorcerer in the past who Gojo is also related to. Yuta finally lets Rika go, and they all live happily ever after. Cool? Good. I will be spoiling stuff that's been animated so far, and I will pull visuals from later, but no real spoilers beyond that, okay? So I'm making this because I like JJK, but I knew from reading it as it was coming out, it is not perfect and has a lot of issues. And I knew that I didn't like JJK Zero, so I figured that by dissecting that, we could get to the root of Gege's issues and then talk about the main series at large and Modulo as a tree. By interrogating the two versions of Zero, we could also compare and contrast where and why one form of the story succeeds. However, this video has gotten me stressed out over 2 months because A, Gege is often unclear, inconsistent, and changes the ideas, themes, and the world of his work, and B, trying to take into account every possible way an individual may interact with the text and also the dialogue it then has with the rest of the series is hard. On the first point, this is because of how JJK Zero came out. First of all, it wasn't called that. My guy called it Tokyo Metropolitan Curse Technical School. Wonder why that didn't stick. Then it got renamed Zero only after Volume 3 was published. Now, beyond silly names, in the physical versions of Zero, Gege has a postscript where he talks about JJK being picked up. If I'm understanding this correctly alongside some interviews I read, he wrote and had Zero published as a one-shot, but didn't intend to seek Jujutsu Kaisen being published, but the serialization team believed Zero was good enough to warrant Jujutsu Kaisen's serialization. This means that Zero was most likely made with large parts of Jujutsu Kaisen in mind, but also needed to be self-contained because it was being published as a one-shot, without knowing if it would get picked up. Shows do this, and other mangaka have overcome that issue, so clearly it's not impossible to write a one-shot and then turn it into a series. Which is why I want to point out the part where Gege says he doesn't think of everything ahead of time. In 2020, he still didn't know where Sukuna was going to go. This means he just changes his mind, or doesn't know what will or will not be significant, which is another thing that makes it harder to write satisfying endings. Not impossible, but it's harder. He also then says he doesn't write with themes in mind. So you could see how all of this, combined together and distilled into the first entry of the world, can make it not good. On B, Zero came out in 2017 as a monthly release, a year before JJK's weekly serialization. So it was the first entry point for people in Japan, but here in the States, Zero did not come out for a while into JJK's physical print. Lots of people just hop straight into the main series first, as that's where the buzz was, and if you were like me, you didn't understand what Zero was until the movie came out in 2021. This movie was hot off the heels of the first season, which aired winter 2020 to 21, but this movie also came out just after Shibuya incident in the manga, going into execution, perfect preparation, and the Culling Games, which means that there was a fervor for the series, and audience expectations were quite different than the original manga. This is then coupled with the fact that because of when it came out, there was so much more information about the world, which meant aspects of the original work needed to be adapted to be congruent with what people thought JJK was, even if the original story was not written with them in mind. In addition, people who were already fans or people who were coming into the series with the Zero movie just had completely different ideas about what JJK was because it was now a cultural force versus the original manga just being made and read by a guy. All that is to say is that I will try to cover the spectrum of engagement with the art, but a lot of this is focused on JJK at large because that's the easiest way to kind of filter these ideas. Zero was made as a one-shot, and as such, if something gets expanded upon later but is still satisfactory within Zero, that's not an issue. I'm just talking about things that don't go anywhere. Okay, let's start with the most obvious thing that's aged this manga, which is simply that the paneling and the page flow is not good. It's often at odds with conveying the information in it. There's very little true motion or sense of fighting or weight across the entire runtime. It just kind of happens and you absorb information as it's told to you. It feels that every panel is different from the panel before and after it. The relationships across images just doesn't exist. It's just at odds with the information it's trying to convey. JJK got so much better at this. Look at Shibuya incident. This one of Toto clapping is amazing because the physical movement of the clap is conveyed across the page, and so the spot where it happens on the next page is physically where Toto's arms would have been. And then what's even better is that you turn the page and the spot where Toto clapped is exactly where Maeshito swung his tail at. That's expertly crafted to convey a sense of movement and make you understand why he would have swung at that space behind him, because you could feel that movement happen. It's ingenious, and there's nothing like that in the manga for JJK Zero. It is just information after barren wasteland. Beyond just the structure of his art, the art itself is also just way more interesting in Jujutsu Kaisen, the main series. He develops this style of keeping his sketch lines in, and he also starts to employ hatching to give such a rough texture to everything. Everything feels like it pops off the page because he also starts to use negative space and high fidelity panels to make characters in this rougher, often unrealistic depiction feel real. He also is really good about using panels of different sizes to accentuate big moments and small moments. He loves to just break panels, reach across, and it always works super well because it feels incredibly human and it elicits these strong emotions because of how he can present his ideas beyond just the writing itself. JJK Zero doesn't really have this. I criticize the structure, I'm gonna criticize the art, but that's not really its fault. It's one of the first things he made, so it's just naturally gonna be weaker, but that doesn't mean it's exempt from criticism, just that it has a lower standard, so I'm not gonna put too much stock into it. I mostly just wanna praise how good JJK is. The movie also just doesn't have this issue because it is a movie made with a higher production budget. Shibuya Incident's anime style is way better by pretty much every metric, but I still think that this anime is fine. It still tries when it needs to. The first big takedown I want to give is the one I think is probably unpopular, but I believe it highlights the main issues of JJK's writing well enough, and I also like engagement baiting. So in chapter 2, the mall section is bad. Firstly, Inumaki is not a character. He's only popular because he's a board to project ideas onto. Beyond the fact that he is a nice and caring guy, can you tell me anything else about him? He cannot communicate, so Panda has to info dump for us, and Yuta spends the entire chapter in a weird way when you think about it, spouting off interpretations of Yuta's actions and reading most things as being about how they can affect him. He also just doesn't matter for the rest of the story. Him and Panda lose to Geto, but you know who doesn't have a section in this story? Panda. However, this character could be fine for a 4-chapter story where we are staking everything on Yuta, but when we look at the main series, it is transparently short-sighted. Inumaki falls out of the story relatively quickly. If I were to hazard a guess, I believe this is because cursed speech is cool on paper and it's easier for a new audience to understand than Hikari's gambling, but it's one-dimensional. You either stop or you die. That's it. The thing he does in Shinjuku's showdown is just that again. It's entirely unremarkable, and given how that fight is constructed, you can take it out and it doesn't really change much. And again, because this guy cannot talk, he becomes tertiary to the story by Shibuya, only existing afterwards to be an attaché to Yuta, not even existing for himself at a point for reasons I won't spoil. Yuta is able to use cursed speech. He is the only student from Tokyo Jujutsu High to really not have a story. But you know who does get a story in the main series? Panda. Okay, fine. So that means this section needs to be about Yuta's growth, right? Well, I think it fails on that front too, as Yuta has not grown enough as a fighter in the 3 months we are told he's been training at Jujutsu High to put more than a scratch on a grade 1. This is the last fight before the climax, and is also the first and only time we see Yuta fight a curse, as the curse at the school is dealt with by Rika, and the curse tool that he uses in the climax is also just Rika powering it. So he never beats a curse on his own, and instead has to be Inumaki's water boy, as he is now the only one who can win, and also the only one to display growth when you think about it, because he's a grade 2 beating a grade 1. Now you might say, well, this section is about how recognizing you can work with others to succeed, which, yeah, that makes sense, but do you want to know what Yuta doesn't do in the climax? I'll mention it again later, but he sits on his ass as his friends go and die, because Gege seems to have forgotten that he needs to actually demonstrate that his characters have grown in the ways he tells us they have. Because Yuta in the climax is basically just the same as Yuta at the end of chapter 1. You can take out pretty much all of chapter 2, and it feels like it makes more sense. His growth at the end is just divorced from what's happening here. There is even less of a point when you think about it. The only reason this grade 1 curse is here is Geto is trying to prod for Rika, yet Rika doesn't show up, so Geto gets nothing out of this. He then chooses to attack Jujutsu High anyways, and that's when he learns of Rika's strength. So again, I'm asking you, what is the point of this section? If Yuta doesn't grow in a way the climax actions upon, and everyone else gets nothing out of this, what short or long-term impact does this have besides, I guess, setting up Inumaki losing his arms being an explanation for why Yuta can misrepresent the execution of Yuji? And that's my issue with Geiko's writing, is that in the moment it seems like it makes sense, it seems fine. When you try and extrapolate information out over the larger story, it just falls apart because things don't have meaning when compared to other things within the story. Under any scrutiny, you can see how things just stop making sense. You might want to argue that, hey, Yuta and Inumaki need to be friends for the finale to happen, but I would argue against that because the finale is just coming out of nowhere. The idea that Yuta is going Super Saiyan with Rika is not established before this. It's not earned, isn't growth. He has no form of development. He just gets upset. So what's the theme then? What, if you make strong enough friendships with people, something bad will happen to them and then it'll just arbitrarily grow stronger through mechanisms that are entirely esoteric to any normal human being? That's not a theme, nor is that the themes that were being established up until this point, because the actual themes he established, he didn't act on. This story relies so heavily on the emotional aspect being the thing that convinces the audience of its worth that it negates any actual physical development of these characters. I do understand that Yuta's later character would be emblematic of the ideas he is talking about here, but my issue is that in JJK Zero, those ideas are not fulfilled. And then when he comes back in JJK the main series, he's just suddenly a new character with a way more interesting personality. So that also doesn't feel earned, even if the story is trying to tell me that the pieces were there the entire time. I'll talk about this a lot, but I need to be very straightforward here. Growth isn't just developing the emotional capabilities to see the people around you as human and being compassionate towards them. It is also displaying over time through repetitive actions that you are now able to meet the opposition around you. You have to do things more than just once to have grown. It's not like after Maki fights the Zenin clan, she drops the ideals. The ideals that were steeled across the story leading up to and refined in that section then come across the rest of the story, which I'm going to use as a segue into the section where Gege does set something up in one part of Zero and pays off in a different part of Zero, the stuff with Maki. Maki fan alert. Maki fan alert. The story element that systems of power value people only on what they can do to reinforce the system, and the idea that power shouldn't be based on how cruel you can be to others, but how much cruelty you can prevent from falling onto others, which are huge themes of JJK, starts here with Maki's disdain for the Zenin clan. While not fully there, we do get a bit of her inner conflict on being good for her purposes and how that causes her to interact with others who are not actively working hard or who perpetuate the system. And Maki specifically talks about needing to destroy the Zenin clan by herself, which I think means Gege knew that that was something he had in mind for the later story. There is some development with Yuta as he sees Maki as an inspirational example, which in turn affects Maki because it's the first time someone hasn't judged her for her background but sees her as an admirable person. It's good foundational work for the story, and it's a decent if scant character arc. Beyond the two main people assisting Yuta, I do want to talk about some other characters because I think their changes between Zero and the main series are just as interesting. Yuta's a bum. He's not a good character from the perspective of he's one-dimensional, he's passive, he doesn't really grow in any way. Everything just kind of happens to him, and then he just gets arbitrarily stronger because the story needs him to. We have to listen to other characters tell us he's gotten stronger. We don't really get to see him get stronger. It's a lot. He sucks. He's just not a good protagonist, dude. I really wish in all the additional material they have for Zero's adaptation, they maybe made Yuta interesting. They give him some flashbacks, and especially this one in the hospital, that really help do something. Once Yuta comes back in JJK, he is way more interesting. Even if I don't particularly care for him, he has a more serious and reserved side, which contrasts with the other dorky parts of his character. He has immense strength, and his attitude is both backing that up, but also derived from it. However, he gets to be silly every so often, and he's matured, but he's still a fun person. He also just gets to act on his own accord and own volition. Even though it's framed as Gojo told me to protect the freshmen, he still chooses to do things throughout the latter half of this story, so he's not just a passive loser. I am dittoing this for Geto, as Geto in Zero is plainly evil. Look at this guy. Throughout the entire runtime, bro is smiling like it is going out of style. We get a little crumb of "you wouldn't kill a young sorcerer," which means that he's simply not evil. He's evil with a caveat. And I want to give big ups to the movie because we get the KFC breakup and other realized flashbacks here, which are such great additions to show how these two actually used to be friends versus the manga just telling us they were. We also get the addition of some stuff with Mimiko and Nanako, which we would also later see in Hidden Inventory, showing Geto isn't evil for the sake of being evil, but he has seen something that has molded his views. However, his later characterization is still so different from how it's presented in the rest of the movie, it feels a little jarring, but I do like that they make the strides to kind of reconcile the two. Also, he somehow goes even on martial arts with Yuta and then gets blasted. Bro's a poser. Finally, the movie actually adds a scene of Geto getting Yuta's ID from the elementary school section. In the manga, he just has it for the abandoned mall section, which makes no sense because we never saw him get it in the first place. And then it's only in a throwaway line at the very end of the story, probably because Gege realized he needed an explanation for how Geto could have even had it, that Gojo says that Geto must have been the one responsible. So to actually see this section realized of him getting the ID means that the abandoned mall section, which follows it, makes sense, instead of the manga just telling us that it makes sense afterwards. Shifting focus back to issues across both of them, Panda. He does get a bit of characterization in the sense that we see that he cares about other people and he like comments on Inumaki, so you kind of get the idea that there's some like friendship or compassion towards others. But he's also weird and perverted about Maki's boobs in a way that is really uncomfortable. And at the end of the story, yeah, he does get to fight Geto in an extended fight scene in the anime, but then he loses, wakes up with everybody else and says, "Congratulations, you've won the day." None of these characters really grow or develop in any significant way, spar from maybe Maki and a bit of Yuta in regards to that one schoolhouse scene. Before we get into the big issue that I think really ruins this story, I want to talk about some miscellaneous fun things I noticed that aren't detrimental in any way, but I think are fun to point out. Yuta can do reverse curse technique, which by itself is crazy, but he can also do it to others. That is insane. That's one of those things that seems to be here without thinking out exactly what it is and what it means, and it would only later be fleshed out as a really powerful tool for the most skilled people. In execution, Yuta can do reverse curse technique. It makes sense there because he's been training for a while, he's been in Africa with Miguel, and he's reached his full potential with Rika. Here, it's just he can do it, which I think is kind of funny. The language around cursed energy and cursed energy manipulation doesn't quite exist yet. For the longest time, they just talk about channeling curses themselves, and we don't really see a lot of techniques, so who knows what the system was actually at. In Chapter 3, Miguel does give Gojo a power level indicator by saying he has strong cursed energy, but it's definitely not until Geto specifically calls out Yuta as having channeled cursed energy through himself to punch harder that we kind of get the inkling of what the system actually is. In the manga, Gojo really does nothing. We get no understanding of what his powers are, what he can do, or where he fits into the wider picture, but his general disdain for the power systems is consistent. Him off-screening Geto in the manga becomes incredibly important to justify how Kenjaku could even get a hold of the body. Gojo can teleport people, which, while that is mentioned in Season 1, the way he does it here is weird because he does a summoning circle and then claps his hands and teleports people. In Season 1, we just gloss over it and never discuss it again. You can barely see Meimei and Ino in the background, which is a fun setup, but Nanami or Kusakabe aren't here, so maybe they weren't thought of yet. And the time frame is really odd. Rika kills the classmates in November 2016, but the night parade takes place in December 2017 when they are freshmen. So when did he transfer in? The Japanese school year starts in April. Thanks, Persona. And the class already has some camaraderie, so he couldn't have transferred in until May 2017 at a minimum. Which then means What was he doing for 6 months after killing the other students? I guess maybe the council were trying to figure out what to do with them, but that's still a long time, and for Yuji it's a much quicker turnaround. The only techniques we see are Inumaki, Geto, and maybe Gojo. He one-taps a guy, and Miguel says it's limitless, but in the anime they make it obviously red, which is cool.
You're in the way.
By the way, I think the only reason this exists is because Gege realized he hadn't shown Gojo doing anything yet, and because part of the story does hinge on Gojo being strong, so then Yuta can inherit that strength, he needed this to happen. Most of these characters are not named in JJK Zero, and most of these character designs in JJK Zero would be changed later. For some reason, Gege decides he's going to make a lot of these characters skinnier. Coward. Something that is both a feature but also a problem of JJK is that there are incredibly few characters consistent throughout the entire story. Maki and Yuji are really the only ones there for almost every single part. Yes, Megumi and Panda are there until Shinjuku Showdown, but Shibuya Incident, Execution, and Perfect Preparation completely reset the cast. Before, you have all these characters, and afterwards you have all these other characters. One of the ways Gege would later figure out how to deal with not having characters on screen for a long period of time was to make them visually striking so you could look at them and then tell me something about them. He hasn't developed that skill yet, so in Zero, he chooses to just not expand on most of the characters. I've already mentioned it, but there's no explanation for Gojo, Miguel, any of Geto's associates, the principal, Panda, the whole system of how cursed energy, techniques, tools, reversal, there's very little explanation for any of this. And that's kind of smart. Don't flood a potential audience with all the convoluted rules, systems, and weird intricacies of the characters. Just give them a guy who cannot do anything with a demon, a girl who cannot do anything with a spear, an anthropomorphic panda, and a guy whose power is just to talk. Then you put them up against an antagonist whose whole thing is just to control the curses. This way, it's super easy to onboard. However, it's also not compelling in any real way because of that. None of the cool stuff about the power system is here, none of the silly stuff about techniques is here, and none of the over-the-top action spectacle is here because the power system, the techniques, and Gege's art is not here yet. Because most people start with JJK, they want to then apply all the knowledge they have of JJK to JJK Zero, despite the fact that it's not there and can be incongruent with the work itself. The big thing most people think about JJK is the strong themes and characters and the creative and unique fights, and that's just not there. The closest you're gonna get is Yuta hitting the Moi Moi Tri-Beam. Now we get to the part of the video where I talk about the section that I think really exemplifies Gege's lack of understanding as to what he was doing at the time when he wrote JJK Zero. The climax of the story sucks because there are a lot of logical inconsistencies in what happens, but the more pressing issue is that none of what's happening actually relates, affects, or influences anything else. Geto says that he's able to go to the school and sneak in because in the past he set up a false idea of how his powers worked with the Jujutsu headmasters. Now, that sounds like a fine explanation, but when you look at it in the context of a story, it's stupid. Because we haven't seen this happen. This is Geto telling us information about something that happened in the past to justify the current actions. This isn't organically building out a story, having Geto do something that allows him to go do it. It's Geto telling us that he already did this. So, off to a bad start. This is a big Achilles heel of Gege, which is he has 2 points he wants to connect, and often instead of coming up with an organic way to link the two, he just puts out like 2 sentences that say, these totally are connected and it's totally justified and don't question it. We see this happen a lot. Furthermore, when Geto says that the way his powers work differs from how they're supposedly supposed to work, that doesn't do anything for us because we don't know how his power works. We've seen him just absorb a curse and we got no explanation for it. So there's no impact to this statement at all. Thirdly, everybody involved in the war has already made it transparently obvious that they think Geto is up to something more than just the parade itself. Both Geto and the headmasters have said that Geto cannot win this war, so he must be doing something suspicious. And yet, none of them think to maybe check in on the guy they've left alone, unguarded at the school. Then there's the big issue, which is that Yuta isn't on the front line. This could be for a few different or compounding reasons, which is that A, Yuta is too risky of an asset to put on the front line, which then again, why are you sending him by himself at the school? B, he isn't strong enough to fight on the front line. C, the war isn't as serious enough to warrant him being on the front line. Or D, Yuta has not been able to get control of Rika enough to be of value on the front line and instead would be too much of a danger to the other sorcerers. In every case, this just makes the story look worse because what have we been doing if we can't use Yuta or he hasn't grown in any capacity? He then turns around and beats Geto with the explanation being that seeing his friends get hurt is what gave him the strength to fight. which then just means that all of the training we have done for the previous 2 chapters is worthless, because Yuta's growth is only spurred on by the effects of others happening and nothing he himself is doing. The climax is lacking in interesting things to actually say, so instead tries to mask this by using the structure of switching back and forth between the school and the night parade. By juxtaposing these two, you create the illusion of meaning when there actually isn't anything. So for example, why does Maki go by herself to fight Geto? She was literally on the other side of the wall with Yuta when the veil was drawn. But because we cut away after Yuta goes, "Oh my, a veil," you forget their relative position to one another, and so Maki being here by herself doesn't appear to be an issue, despite the fact that it makes no sense, as she would have definitely been able to talk to Yuta and Yuta would have definitely been able to talk to her. This is a missed opportunity to say something about these two characters, where they handle the situation, discuss something, maybe we learn something about them. It's moving over the most interesting part of the story to get to a fight that also ends off screen. The opposite of moving over something interesting is to just add it in after the fact, which is what Gege does with his use of flashback. While later in JJK he will use flashback well, here he just doesn't have it, instead using it as a way to cover his ass. For example, this one of Yuta at the end only exists to completely change what his story is about and gaslight the audience into thinking that this story was always about how Yuta cursed Rika, despite the fact that that element is not present before this point at all. Thus, the ending has nothing to do with the rest of the story. This is because Yuta seems pretty determined and often realistically trying to host the idea of freeing Rika throughout the entire story. The themes of this story before the flashback were about wanting to be close despite knowing the risks it can cause, that you have to keep trying despite past failures and trauma, and you are the one who determines if something is a hindrance or a boon, which, while not antithetical to the point being made in this flashback at the end, it's just a different set of themes. For example, if the version of the flashback we saw at the start of the story was the one that played at the end, and then they play the one at the end again at the end, we would be able to recontextualize the information that is present in that flashback. By seeing Yuta at the start of the story say, "Rika, don't die," we would then be able to go like, "Oh yeah, that was set up from the start." Instead, if you go back to that original flashback, guess what? Yuta doesn't say anything. He just goes, "Oh, Rika?" So the only reason this flashback at the end exists is because Gege desperately needs to justify why his ending has no build-up or anything to do with anything else by just telling you, the audience, that that's actually what was supposed to happen the entire time. I don't want to be mean to anybody, but it's insane to me that anybody likes this ending because none of it matters or is built up, and it's just 3 different layers of just making up aspects of the story because he never thought about what anything was actually going to result in. Also on the juxtaposition front, no, he doesn't use any image or symbol juxtaposition. Just thought I'd mention that. Why does Geto whip out Tamano no Mai? It does nothing, and is combined with Uzumaki anyways. Why is Geto playing for time? It's in his best interest to be fast. Geto offscreens all 3 characters, which is a cop-out. Geto's plan is kind of stupid because he only unleashes 1/3 of his actual curse supply at both of the night parades. Even if he needed to use the curses to beat Yuta, he still should have released, I don't know, maybe 4,000? I mean, it doesn't even matter because he loses regardless, so who cares? But come on, dude. Why does Gojo getting information about Yuta's lineage make him realize Geto is at Jujutsu High? If we are working off the information we already know, that Geto supposedly cannot harvest from the dead, this doesn't change anything. Plus, Geto already has expressed interest in Yuta and people think something suspicious might be happening. Everyone is stupid. And why does Gojo not go to Jujutsu High himself? I understand why Gojo isn't at the school. He's sending Panda and Inumaki in his stead. I'm just saying that I think his plan here is incredibly risky and unnecessarily relying on contingencies to go in his favor. He has to hope that Geto is beating Panda and Inumaki in a way that is conducive to Yuta's change, that Yuta is spurred on to change by this, and that he grows enough to overcome Geto, who we are told is one of the strongest characters in the verse at this point in time, that Geto doesn't win this fight, because if Geto wins this fight, it's game over, man. He seems to be way too comfortable taking such a big risk and hoping that Yuta's able to control Rika, win the day, and not have everything at Jujutsu High blow up. In the manga, we don't see the scale of the defense, so it could be excused as they really need him on the front line. But in the movie, we see everybody pitching in to help, so it doesn't seem to be that he has to be here. One thing Shibuya Incident has that I really like is that even though it's just Sukuna and Gojo / Sukuna and Maharanga, the other sorcerers are so outclassed it is a threat to them as bystanders. But importantly, we see hundreds of thousands of people in Shibuya who are directly threatened and killed. This applies to the rest of Shibuya Incident as well, as we see a lot of named characters get either severely hurt, killed, or taken out of action for the rest of the series. so there's just more tangible impact from what's happening. Which is why, and I'll bring this up again later, I don't like the Night Parade because it doesn't feel like there's any threat here. They're just trying to clear an early round in zombies. Because the only fight we actually see between the sorcerers is Geto and Miguel. We have no idea what the human threat is, and for the curses, we have no idea how strong they actually are, because the only time we see people fight curses is the two schoolhouse and mall scene. But importantly, when Geto shows up at Jujutsu High, he spawns a bunch of curses. We don't see anybody take care of them. They're dealt with off screen. So we just have to trust, based on what everybody else says, that the Night Parade is a threat. So going back to what I said 30 seconds ago, is the Night Parade an actual threat? Because it's supposedly not serious enough to warrant Yuta being risked, yet we're told it's all-out total warfare and we see everybody on the front line. This raises the further question of, the Night Parade, does it do anything? To set it up with such urgency and have everyone be tied up in it, only to stop mentioning it after a point, is ludicrous. It's so one-dimensional. We have such an incomplete understanding of it that my only idea is that Gege didn't know what to do with it, so he just quietly moved on. And it worked because most people don't even seem to think about this. The argument in favor of how it's handled is that it's secondary. We are told the point is just to waste time, which is probably what the author was thinking, but that doesn't mean you have to waste my time. Do me the courtesy of ending it, because I want to like that we see everybody pitching in for the Night Parade, but given that it just drops out of the story with no one mentioning it again after we see Miguel and Gojo, what the hell is the point? The Night Parade is only built up and used to the point that Gege feels it's satisfactory to explain why he can have Yuta's and Geto's things happening. Everything he writes is just to solve one specific issue at a time. Why introduce all of Geto's associates? If none of them do anything but Miguel, it's just a failure to use the tools you have. As it stands, Laru, Nanako, Mimiko, and the others whose name I don't know are just JJK versions of Glup Shitos. Hell, we don't even see anybody's techniques here. It's just that Gege later decided that Miguel was going to be saved from this story and important to the story at large. I like these characters come back later, but it doesn't mean they're characters. I'm happy Laru's here. What can you tell me about him? The veil doesn't do anything for the narrative, as no one tries to escape, and then it's broken into immediately, so we lose saying something about Yuta or saying something about Geto. And finally, the way this story actually resolves has nothing to do with what we have previously established, both with Yuta sacrificing himself so others could live, despite his entire character growth supposedly being about solving the Hedgehog's dilemma, as well as freeing Rika's curse by slowly untangling the knots. That's just not true. He just hits the love beam and wins. So what the hell is Gege trying to say here? It's not that he's just failing to show Yuta growing, he instead shows Yuta not growing demonstrably throughout the story and instead just writes a bunch of people telling us he gets stronger, so we get to the end and we've had no sense of growth or development on any front at all. The guy literally wins the day because he was born better. Hey y'all, I want to inject with an epiphany I've had about why the writing of this manga works so poorly by using an example of Gege not following through on anything he sets up and thus shooting himself in the foot. In the first chapter, the oppositional force we immediately establish is the Council of People that want to execute Yuta, while Gojo is trying to fight for the livelihood of Yuta, and Yuta obviously doesn't necessarily really want to die. This exists because we need anti-antagonistic force for the first chapter, as Geto doesn't show up till the latter half of chapter 2, really chapter 3. However, once Geto shows up, the execution aspect just stops mattering. It doesn't get mentioned again after Gojo meets with them at the beginning of chapter 2. However, the stipulations established by the Execution Council that Rika can't be let out and, go crazy still exists, which then puts us into a bind, because that means that Yuta can't really train with Rika or let Rika go crazy, because we've established that if this happens again, he'll be executed. But, in order to beat Geto at the end, we do need Rika to come out and attack, which means that we literally cannot develop up until the point that the climax wants to happen. Instead, we have to relegate our development to Yuta channeling the curse into his sword, which doesn't really work because that's not really what happens with Yuta at the end of the story. So, you have a situation where the author has imposed restrictions on themselves because they didn't really think about how the plot was going to go, thus we get to an ending where we just have to pull something out of our ass because we just wrote ourselves into a very obviously avoidable bind. There are no real themes in any of this work. None of the events that happen are building up to a logical conclusion endpoint where we can say something about the worlds, the characters, and the ideas. It's just that a bunch of things that look neat happen and you just forget about it immediately afterwards. I'm going to counter my own point here and say I actually don't like how Maki's handled for the rest of the runtime of this manga. I think the moments she has at Jujutsu High really displaying her character arcs and development are nice and welcome and we get to know something about her, but The way she's handled at the school section feels bad, as in she just gets entrapped by this giant curse and then has to be saved by Yuta. This is where I think we do start to see the actual subtle misogyny that Gege does write into his work. A lot of people meme on this and don't want to take it seriously, but I think it's really important because the only female character in this story for the most part is Maki. Her also being the only person excluded from the power system isn't inherently bad, but it does feel a little off. Yes, I know her story is about overcoming that, and I'm not here to really say that this was bad writing. I'm just saying that on the outset, to have the only female character be the one who can't use powers is just something to keep in mind as we go further. Rika is literally a dead child who only exists to be a vessel and tool for growth for the main character. She has no character outside of the fact that she loves a man, which is true all the way into Modulo. I will give Mappa credit for adding more female characters to this story in the anime, so good on them for recognizing that women exist. One thing Mappa can't change is that Gege decided to use violence against women as a motivator for a male character. That's a classic trapping. There's no real way to sugarcoat it, especially given that Yuta then basically treats her like an object and somewhat of a damsel in distress with the language he uses, because at first he starts by saying treat her gently when he's talking to Rika, but then he decides to describe her as a butterfly or a flower, which is just all kinds of gross, especially given that Maki's entire character is that she wants to be seen as a strong warrior, somebody who is smart, intelligent, and can lead. To do this to her feels bad. This also opens up the avenue of criticism for the fact that this story doesn't really pass the Bechdel test, because you have what, Nanako and Mimiko, and even then, they have 2 pages, and if they're not talking about Geto, they're talking to Geto about something, so it's not romantic, it's platonic, but still. The only other option on that test is that we got Rika and Maki. Rika only has this interaction because she is jealous of Maki for being an object of obsession for Yuta, which means this entire interaction happens because of the infatuation over a male character. There's just no real excuse for it, especially given how Yuta responds, like I mentioned before. It just feels gross on all fronts. A lot of the issues I've been mentioning for the past 15 or so minutes are issues just across the board for JJK Zero, but they may be altered or entirely removed by the time we get to JJK, which is why I need to talk about this from the perspective of hindsight. When the movie was being made, it's hard to know if they had a whole lot of knowledge about what was happening in the future, because the chapter where Maki gets her heavenly restriction reinforced to become punished Maki would only come out in May 2021, so even if they had a decent amount of runtime, they probably couldn't have seen that far into the future. So they had to work off where the apparent direction of the story was going, and because Maki was somewhat of an important character up until this point, and Inumaki stopped being relevant after the first few arcs of the story, I think that's why they choose to invent a new flashback for Maki for this movie. I'm bringing all this up because when you read the manga, you have no idea how relevant these characters are going to be. In 2017, Inumaki and Maki could have been equally important characters to the story. But when we get to the movie, we know that Inumaki doesn't matter, so his section is inherently going to feel slightly less interesting because the character just doesn't get utilized later. He's not a character we actually care about. Especially when the 3rd chapter of this same one-shot is more Maki focused and has nothing with Inumaki at all, it makes it feel entirely as an afterthought in the movie. Especially with Yuta and Maki connecting here being one of the very few pieces of connective tissue that runs all the way to Modulo. Due to the production budget afforded to this movie, it is probably the best version of this story. Firstly, there's color, it looks good and is used well. Secondly, while Gojo still doesn't do a whole lot in the movie, when we see him do stuff, he has a bit more weight behind it, he's more agile, it feels like he's very efficient with how he moves. So the power that Miguel speaks about his name is kind of true, or at least feels more earned than the way it is in the manga. Miguel also gets the opportunity to throw hands. He just kind of gets rolled in the manga. But in the anime, Miguel feels strong because he's really holding his own against Gojo for a while. We see Meimei and Ino kill curses, Kusakabe is doing his shtick, and Nanami actually gets the opportunity to serve here. The Kyoto School appears, which is appreciated because half of these characters need any screen time they can get, and the idea that this is a huge event is conveyed more. Inumaki and Panda have a decently complex fight against Geto. I like how we see Geto step over Maki's body after he's beaten her. It makes it feel like they actually fought instead of in the manga where we just kind of come back to it with Panda and Inumaki and all of a sudden Maki's lying on the floor. The movie has a better implementation of flashbacks because it actually adds new ones to say something about the characters and relationships. It makes Rika and Yuta's relationship feel tangible. This is a stark improvement over everything I was criticizing Gege of before. The animation is solid for most of the time. It's nothing too amazing, but does its job. And the post-credit scene with Yuta and Miguel is sick, and it's a fun little teaser. Because it came out after season 1, they could retroactively rely on the audience already knowing all of these characters and the world, but they were also beheld to audience expectations that these characters should be in the story. And they know what comes after with hidden inventory, so they can work in all that information because chronologically it's already supposed to have happened. So all of this means that they had a pretty tough task laid out for them, but they do a pretty decent job at bringing it all together, making it feel cohesive, and work both as a single story but also into the rest of JJK's universe. I do find the latter half of this film enjoyable because its pacing is good, they invent new things, and it's just more fun, even if the story's not interesting. However, the first half of this story is just a boring slog to get through. The pacing is horrendous. Part of that issue is that you can tell they allocated the budget for the latter half of the film because the first half is just a shot-for-shot remake of the original chapters. But the other part of that issue is that Yuta is such a bad protagonist because he is just uninteresting. And it doesn't have to be this way because we have a better version of the same character in this world. His name is Yuji. Yuji is also someone who is entirely new to the Jujutsu world. He's a freshman at Tokyo Jujutsu High, endowed with an incredibly strong power that is technically not a part of him but also revealed to sort of be a part of him, that is from a really powerful person in the past, that also puts him in the crosshair of an individual resembling Geto, while also being assisted by a removed member of the Zenin clan, and Gojo is here to mentor him a bit, but not all the time. However, I think this is mildly more interesting, because Yuji's reaction to all this is more unconventional. He isn't scared, his incredible physical prowess and confrontation of danger is juxtaposed with his underspoken humanity. I think what makes Yuji more interesting than Yuta is that he's the idealistic version of ourselves. He's somebody we want to be, while Yuta's somebody who we relate to in a sense that we want him to grow and change because we see ourselves in him. But this also means that a lot of Yuta's conflict is internal, and it's a little one note. While Yuji's conflict is both internal and external, the grand threats around him both are physical threats he has to deal with, but also affect his internal world and how he perceives relationships and living and what it means to have value in your life. I think it's more compelling for a narrative front. We also get a more defined objective: get these 20 fingers or everyone may die, versus you'll somehow maybe figure out how to free Rika. And immediately we establish a villain with obvious goals that are intertwined with the protagonist. Finally, Yuji's able to fail on his own. Yuji makes choices, he loses, he suffers the consequences, and he grows. Yuta is such a passive character, and yes, that is the point, but it makes for a less interesting protagonist because things happen to him and then he acts. If you need any single statement as to why JJK as a whole is so well liked, it is the characters, which I think is evident in the fact that JJK establishes what makes Yuji different so quickly. You can ask most JJK fans why they like it so much, and it will most often boil down to these characters are all unique with interesting things to do, say, and represent over the course of the story. People love Gojo because from the start he has incredibly strong convictions about where Jujutsu Society should head. He's distant, thinking about his own individual things a lot of the time. He's goofy in a serious situation, can be serious when it's necessary. He has the position of being the mentor while also being a hard-to-read dick. He often does whatever he wants with no respect to authority or standards. Furthermore, each individual character being unique means they are often catalysts for the different thematic ideas throughout the story. Most characters, even those who exit early, have something interesting to say, and even the ones Gege forgets to actually conclude are still depicted with such compelling art as to be interesting. I love Hikari because my boy got swag, even if his ideas about opening Jujutsu Society fall through the cracks. JJK's themes only work because Yuji is actually interesting, and after the first 3 arcs, he becomes a quite compelling protagonist. Zero doesn't have this. We get an idea about Gojo, but he hasn't realized enough in the page count to really move anything, which means we got what? Maki? Everybody else is a stock character who may or may not have anything to say. It just doesn't work. If you read the Zero manga, it is not remarkable. If you were to read this and then pull up a set of chapters from the Shibuya incident and beyond, it is night and day. That's to be expected, but I think a lot of people in hindsight overrate Zero because the rest of JJK is good. So what's my point? Well, I'm going to continue my smear campaign against Gege Akutami, but I do want to recognize that while I don't think JJK Zero is good, that's mostly on the manga. It is semi-professional, amateurish at best, and it just doesn't really work in a lot of aspects. However, the anime is marginally better, and if you're at all interested in the story of JJK from top to bottom, you should watch it. What I find the most interesting isn't just is the anime good, is the manga bad, it's what Gege as an artist has revealed about himself here. Because I don't want to misrepresent it, he definitely thinks of things ahead of time, but he doesn't think of everything and how it all comes together ahead of time. And trying to address those shortfalls, even though he got better as a writer and artist, also reveals how he didn't get better as a writer or sometimes as an artist. And that's probably the most enlightening thing you can learn about any creative you're interested in, the humanity they instill in their work by being imperfect. I'm gonna talk a little bit about the ending here, but it's just for structural parallels between the main series and JJK Zero. I'll save the actual maybe spoiler stuff for later. Most of the complaints people had after the ending were that so many ideas were introduced throughout the course of the story and then were never developed or resolved. It does truly feel like Gege figured out how the fight between Yuji and Sukuna would go, so he was just trying to get there in an interesting way, which constantly meant creating and discarding ideas and characters. People talk about how Hikari and Uraume fight off-screen for like 30 chapters and then just walk away. Gege set something up and then he never did anything with it. Him not knowing how to deal with his lack of foresight is his biggest weakness, not necessarily the lack of foresight itself. He says in the postscript that the themes come regardless, which is true. One of the big thematic things people like about JJK is that people do just exit your life. The value of life is so complex that it can feel insurmountable to find that meaning when someone is dead and the death is indiscriminate. Part of the theme is a byproduct of Gege discarding ideas as he went on and working towards big moments, but the vestigial aspects of that are in Zero, with Yuta and Rika and Geto and Gojo. They both have musings on how they projected ideas, with Yuta literally doing this onto others, and they hadn't really processed the value of the life and the value of the memories that they had. You can criticize Gege all you want for many justified reasons, but one thing I have a newfound appreciation for is that the entire thing that is JJK feels like one thing, despite the fact that it is two radically different things with radically different tones and characters by the end. I have read all of JJK and then I went back and reread Zero, and I didn't even realize that none of the power system or explanation for anything was here the first time I read it. If you look at the climax of Zero and the climax of JJK, they are wildly different. A lot of this has to do with the slowly accumulating complexity of the power system and the world. I believe this is because Gege was recognizing where his strengths lie and was making rapid pivots into the departments where he knew he could excel in, which was able to successfully happen in a very small period of time. It's not like in One Piece where we had almost 30 years to build up to what's happening in the manga right now. Depending on how you want to count Zero, JJK had 6 or 7. Furthermore, Gege was pretty good about bringing back minor characters when they could be relevant, and even though the cast is constantly shifting, they all feel like they belong because they dip out and they come back again. There are very few times you see a character one time and one time only. The unnamed Geto associates from before do come back in Shibuya, and LaRue does come back in Shinjuku, and we do get to learn a little bit more about them, even if I still wish it was something greater than that. We start the story with the only thing being that we have people who can exercise curses, and then by the end of it, we haven't exercised curses in like 100 chapters, and the antagonist, power system, protagonist, and most of the supporting cast are entirely new. Despite everything, the theme that life doesn't have a determined value that is defined in memory, but actively how the memories of the world you have interacted with it live and give you value has been here from the start. What a lot of people remember about JJK is the big fights, and that's not something that was there at the start. I talked about this at the top of the video, but Gege's art at the start of this manga is not good enough to really sell a fight. There is either little flow of continuous movement, or the action is smeared in such a way that it doesn't really tell us anything. So to see how good he became later on is kind of insane. His sense of movement and page flow improves so dramatically, it does feel like a different person wrote this. Because Gege was getting better at depicting his fights and making his fights more compelling to a mass audience, it meant the focus of the manga started to shift to longer, drawn-out, flashier fights. The themes and ideas that people like about JJK became increasingly tied into the fights themselves. The fights became increasingly more complex and needed to keep scaling higher and higher to meet audience expectations. This meant that the jobbers did get more of a screen time, but less of a long-term impact in the story, while Kenjaku and Sukuna were getting built up to even higher degrees to make them prepared for the final battle. This manga accelerationism can be seen in something like My Hero. A complaint a lot of people have about My Hero is that the story increasingly centralizes around All for One as an antagonist, that everything about this narrative and tone has to be in service of him. JJK kind of has this issue as things do become increasingly centralized around Kenjaku and Sukuna. It's to a lesser extent because a lot of the narrative is about bringing back people from the past to accelerate the future, so the natural implication of having Kenjaku and Sukuna be more important in the past is usually fine. Even though we don't know what Kenjaku's deal is for a very long time, his plan to steal Gojo is established incredibly early on, and the tone of the story is consistent throughout. A lot of people talk about how Shibuya is this great leveling incident, and that's true, but Yuji's killed off rip in this story. Because we understand that death is a threat in Zero and Season 1, it's like the slow progression to more violence, and fighting is the natural progression of the story, as opposed to My Hero, where Horikoshi is too scared often to kill a lot of the main characters and instead relegates it to a few side characters here and there. Everybody gives praise to Gege for having an in-universe reason for why characters explain their techniques to each other, but I also want to give praise to Gege for specifically making the narrative of the story be about power scaling. So you can introduce more complex and powerful characters, power scaling the entire verse, and it feels natural. You never stop and go, where was this character before? Because we already know that they probably didn't exist at the time. I'm choosing to believe that Gege was smart and recognized that because he hasn't thought of every aspect of the world, he needed to come up with a device that would allow him to continually attach things to the story to lessen the amount of times he just randomly comes up with something and has to say it's okay. This reveals to us another way that Gege is able to fix his earlier writing issues. When we get to JJK the main series, Gege is way better about using interesting juxtaposition throughout his story to say and have unique circumstances for the characters to express themselves. This is also coupled with just better implementation of flashbacks, because he tends to reserve it for when a character is about to die, thus he can say something about their disposition up until that point in time, and usually it also says something about kind of where the fight was headed, and it caps off their character in interesting ways. And this allows him to sneakily get away with things like having a fight and then the next chapter starts and a character is dead, because you can just have the flashback in there where you don't have to really show what happened and it doesn't actually feel BS like the thing with Maki in Zero does. So for an example of a good flashback use, Sukuna's flashback with the character I can't name for spoiler reasons reinforces the thematic ideas of Sukuna having all the power in the world but being incredibly lonely and unsatisfied his entire life. It's a cherry on top an already existing relationship that's been going on throughout the fight, and a story element that runs throughout the latter half of the narrative. It's not all hits, mind you, but it's more hits than misses in my opinion. This is good in the sense that you are essentially guaranteeing yourself unlimited creativity within the bounds of your own work. However, it means that as the story goes on, and especially as we get to the end point, things are at great risk of spiraling out of control. And then you don't have time at an ending, or you don't even have any means of setting up an ending that is satisfactory to most people. JJK's ending is notoriously controversial. The portion I want to talk about is that Gege had a multitude of things happen in the world that were not getting resolved, and his attempts to address them are messy and incomplete. Gege just didn't know how to deal with it, and so then he ran from the issue. Zero is reflective of this to a lesser degree. To recap, Yuta breaks Rika's curse, but Gege doesn't want him to suffer any consequences for his actions, so he just doesn't die through whatever means necessary. He gets to keep Rika, and when asked how any of this would happen, Gojo just says, "We're related, so it's okay." Everybody gets healed off screen, people stop mentioning the night parade, and then we all just walk off into the sunset and enjoy the rest of our lives. The main series of JJK is also running into these same trappings towards its end, but I think it's to a lesser degree here because the thematic ideas, the main points the story is trying to say throughout the runtime are maintained at the end, and a decent amount of the characters get solid resolutions, not all of them, but, you know, Gege. It sounds like I've been saying that Zero has issues that have been solved by the main series, but let me be clear, Gege still has a lot of issues in his writing. I think people are way too forgiving of Gege for his bad writing because yes, there might be an explanation somewhere out there for why certain things may make sense that aren't initially obvious to us, the audience, but you should be able to read your story and logically understand what's happening for the most part. Even if it's a mystery where something comes up later and you finally get an explanation, stuff should be intuitive from the text itself. We shouldn't have to collect information like Destiny 1 Grimoire cards, okay? This is accentuated by the volume of information he will dump, so there's not a lot of world building, but there's definitely a lot of world information, so it can be really hard to keep track of what's true, what's not true, and how everything's organized. If you saw the Culling Games in theaters, you know what I'm talking about. They just flash you with them. Then we have to slow it way down and just have endless dialogue so we can explain to you what's actually happening. Because of the complexity of information and how it's distributed to us, the audience, I believe that's why we see so many surface level reads of the characters in this work. This has a flip side though, which is that Gege could write a really compelling character or a really interesting idea, and people just choose to interpret it however they want. Unfortunately, a lot of people do just read manga with their eyes closed, and so they will just see a character that they like the design of or like 2 facts about and just headcanon whatever they want about it. This is not to slander fanfiction, I don't really care, but it does mean that people will often forget what the actual truth of a character is and instead just headcanon or make up whatever they want about somebody. But saying that somebody's gonna willfully misinterpret his story doesn't excuse the fact that he doesn't make his stories clear or thought out most of the time, which brings me to my next complaint. He will invent something at a moment in time because he needs to gaslight the audience into thinking that something's always been happening because he didn't see it ahead of time. When you look at something like Shibuya Incident, Maestro splitting up is introduced at one point and then retconned as to having happened much earlier despite there being no evidence of it before this point. Gege just thought this would be a good thing to have happen because he wanted Nobara to come down into the subway, so he just invented this on the spot to justify it. I wish Gege was better about using his previously established ideas about the world, tying more things back to deepen the world. Instead, we get world building as a remedy for a current issue in the manga. One of those things that once you notice, it's hard to unnotice is that so much of JJK's world building is done as a way for Gege to minimize a plot hole or inconsistency. Instead, spinning it as actually the world works this way and this appears to be deeper. This dampens his writing as so much of potentially interesting ideas become told to us instead of shown to us. Dramatic tension is built by establishing something, reminding your audience, and then having a payoff. Imagine the tension if we knew there was a second Maestro running around sooner. Imagine how cool the payoff would have been if we knew earlier about Chozo feeling when his brothers died. That way, when he was about to kill Yuji and reacted, we as an audience could have had the payoff of realizing what that meant, instead of having the narrative tell us later what was going on there. Imagine if we saw Inumaki lose his arms. Imagine! Finally, many of his attempts to reference earlier parts are retcons or lessen the meaning. This is done because he's trying to give validity to a current event, and so he wants to make any sort of connection to a previous one possible, and he'll desecrate the meaning of that event through whatever means necessary. There's a complex added dimension to this, which is that Gege just wanted to end the manga a lot sooner than he actually did, which, regardless of why or how it manifests, it means that the chances of getting satisfying character resolutions is just less likely. If your heart's not in it, then you're just not going to be firing on all cylinders. All of this combined does mean that my opinion of Gege's writing has gone down a little bit, but the core tenets of his work, the central ideas and themes, I do believe are strong enough to warrant engaging with them and reading them and deriving meaning from them. So it's important to reconcile your perception of the work with the actual quality of the work, just to appreciate why it works and why it doesn't. I think that because I was reading it weekly up until the manga ended, and that ending was such a disappointment to a large variety of people, I chose to kind of just separate myself from it and remember the parts that really mattered to me. It's maybe why Maki's my favorite character and I really like Hikari. But when I look back at the whole, it's made me realize that so much of this doesn't go anywhere or has no real connective tissue to anything else. It's so haphazard. Gege's propensity to write himself into a corner means that a lot of his long-term threads and story building ideas just end unceremoniously. And when you look at something like Modulo, he's done it again. Okay, so I guess I have to talk about Modulo. It's bad, but as I've made this video, it has gotten better and worse. As of chapter 17, this story is a confused, overwritten, badly paced, tonally inconsistent, uninteresting, poorly explored slog with uncompelling art. Modulo is a limited series, so it is under slightly different constraints, but all my critiques still apply. Even more so, to be honest. When I heard of Modulo, my concern was that this was going to be a Boruto situation, which is, in premise, true. But we have more of a Dragon Ball Super situation here, where the original creator is shifting to a writing position while bringing on a new artist to do the main series art. On paper, this seems to be the move, but it misses why the original series worked, which was the art was in connection with the writing. With a limitation of Jump's grueling weekly format bred innovation and unique ideas. Now that all the energy is in the writing itself, it's written terribly. And here's where I tie all of this video together. Every complaint I have made about JJK comes back here. He does not trust his artist at all, and just dumps walls and walls of text for chapters on end. Like before, he throws a million things out so he could build off of it in the future with no regard for how that affects the flow and pace of the story now, or if he will ever do anything with it in the future. This has already bitten him in the ass in Modulo because of a certain character he did not set up properly, and thus had to do the trademark telling, not showing. He has no understanding of the importance of information, for example, aliens existing. We get told one of the 2 to 3 main characters has a brain tumor that is going to kill her in 6 months or less, and it has all the weight of a napkin at a little kid's birthday party. Furthermore, she specifically says she doesn't want her brother to know because she wants him to live unobstructed, which could have been an interesting and compelling way to frame the rest of the narrative, but then we just skip ahead 3 to 4 months. What? Most of her life is over, and now he obviously knows because his sister is going blind. So once again, we skip over the most interesting and compelling parts of this world to get to a fight. This fight, in chapter 14, by the way, is the first time when reading the manga where I saw that the sauce might still exist, but he is so close to just not having it. Gege does not know what he wants this manga to be. For the first dozen chapters, he is batting around so many ideas before settling on the idea that the Sumerians and Jujutsu Society need to go to war. As seen in Zero, this has made the first half of the story pointless. because it is so unfocused and without clear implications that you could easily skip over half the page count where they're just talking about random parts of the state of the world and not really be affected. Because of how short Modulo is supposed to be, he just does not have time to be wasting it on all these things that do not matter. The order of information dissemination is terrible, and Dabura is the pinnacle of this. While Dabura is ominous and around, we are just consistently told he is strong, and he's not the main alien we focus on. We don't see his strength. In one of the worst writing decisions I have ever seen in my life, we get this incredibly rushed-through flashback of what was happening in the Sumerian homelands, but we are told that Maru and Cross, which are the two main alien characters, their father figure Daru was a strong warrior. We only get that information towards the end of the flashback when other characters tell us that in the past, this guy was really strong, and apparently he defeated the strongest warrior from the tribe that is oppressing them in a battle. We never see this, dude! This information is just told to us right before another fight. Where have I seen that exact situation happen before? So then he fights Dabura, the champion of the other tribe, which we don't see either. We only see the aftermath, after Dabura already kills him, and people telling us that it was never a fair fight. So what's happened is that we are getting second-hand power scaling information on how strong Dabura is, because we never see him do any fighting against Dura, and we never see Dura doing any fighting against anybody else. So we just have to trust that people telling us he's the strongest character on this planet is just the truth. What? Are you serious, Gege? The only way we get into it how strong he actually is that his character is modeled on Dabura from Dragon Ball. So you have to have read a completely different series and remember the mid-level boss of the Boo Saga to maybe understand that he's a powerful person. Then in another terrible writing decision, after Dura is dead and Dabura's fight is won, we then get the information that apparently Dabura and Dura were really good friends in the past and had been friends for 10 years, and that the reason each of them were strong was because they were training one another? What are you doing, Gege Akutami? Like Maestro and Chozo, we have not built up to any of this in any capacity, and all the quote-unquote world building is Gege just telling us stuff after the fact, and it says nothing. Sure, Dura and Dabura talk to each other in the arena, but once again, imagine how much better that would have been if we had seen over the course of some chapters that they were actually friends with the history. Okay, hear me out on this one. I understand why we have this whole section about the canal and what it says, because again, with no grace, no subtlety, Gege is just saying, you cannot appease the oppressor, they will always oppress you no matter what. I understand. We shouldn't have done it this way, because we focus so heavily on building this canal and what building that canal will mean in the grand scheme of things, that we have no grounding of the story between the two tribes. We needed to introduce Dabura earlier and maybe show his relationship with Dura, incorporate that with the canal somehow, because then you can have this very complete idea that this canal is being built for a greater purpose to service everybody, and that on the human front, that these two cultures really aren't that different, thus the oppression of these people makes no sense. Obviously, we're not stupid, we know that oppression is bad, but my point is that within the story, we just have to attach all that information about Dabura to the end of it because we focus so heavily on just what the canal means. And I understand that something is being said about how Dura is so short-sighted that he's literally causing more oppression upon his people by doing this, but we also completely fail to ever show the Deskinites in any capacity at all. I'm assuming that Gege is going to show us more of the Deskinites later and actually flesh them out in some capacity, but given that there's, 13 or so chapters left, who knows on that front. I do like the themes and ideas that are being presented here, don't get me wrong. I think there's something to be said and it's quite interesting, but the flashback is so hyperfixated on telling us what the themes of this story are that we get to the end and then it realizes that we have to do all this stuff with Dabura because he has to be the tribal leader or whatever by the time we get to Earth, so we just attach him on, and then that feels incredibly short-sighted given how much people talk about the oppression of the Deskinites throughout the manga. Stop me if you've heard this one before, but Gege Akutami wrote a section to just solve one specific issue and address one specific idea without considering all the other elements that are attached to it. I hate to keep defaulting to One Piece, but this is why Oda's writing works. God Valley works because we've been setting it up for a while. We've been setting everything up with Garling. We've been setting everything up with Kuma. All of these have been built up over time to matter. I'm gonna stop for a second because I can hear a very obvious complaint coming. It's 30 chapters. He can only do so much. I get you, 100%, we're on the same page. And he does include this little bit of Dabura resisting cursed speech, which is a nice touch, but I don't think it actually works as well as people want it to work because we don't really understand the powers of the person who's using it because he's only been very vague and in the background. And also, sorcerers are just weaker nowadays. That's information we do have, so him being able to resist cursed speech doesn't actually say as much as I think people want it to say. But I'm so frustrated about this because Gege is using his time to do nothing. Like I said, those first dozen or so chapters just have nothing to say for the most part. And instead of focusing on really accentuating Dabura as a threat and really getting to feel like we understand Sumerian society, we're just dicking around most of the time with way too many characters. And then we decide that once we need this fight in chapter 14 to start, that all the power scaling is out the window, and Dabura is going to be a favorite in the fight against Maharanga. What? I get it in the sense that we have been told a million times that this guy is stronger than Sukuna, and that naturally if he's stronger than Sukuna, he must be stronger than Maharanga. But it just feels so unearned. I need to explain to you in no uncertain detail why this fight doesn't work by comparing it to a fight that does. The reason Sukuna's fight against Maharanga works is because we get the fight against Jogo right before this. But even before that, we get him one-tapping Nanako and Mimiko. And for some reason, if you want to say, well, that's just like the Dura-Dabura fight, which besides the fact that no, it isn't because we actually see Jogo before this, we know how strong he is, we've seen him fight, and the Nanako and Mimiko thing is just about showing off speed, not necessarily strength, but okay, we'll throw that out the window. What else have we seen? Well, we still know Sukuna is strong because we have seen the guy sorbet a special grade cursed spirit. That we also know how strong is because it has cut Yuji's arm off and effectively killed him or put him very close to death. Furthermore, we also have seen Sukuna in his mind palace thing just chop Yuji's head off in this blink of an eye. So we do have a baseline understanding of how strong he is because we've seen it, and this is also where you can get away with then telling us stuff. Because now we know how strong he is, thus you can say, well, if he gets more fingers, he's going to become even stronger, so when we actually get around to the Maharanga fight, it feels like his increase in power makes sense because we understand the mechanics at play because they've been on display. The way the Dabura Maharanga fight is built up is as if you had just seen Sukuna kill Nanako and Mimiko and had heard about him beating Jogo with the one pose of Stand Proud at the end. But you don't know who Jogo is at all, so it just doesn't do anything. Yes, we're still on the Dabura Maharanga fight, but I think by examining one issue in all of its totality, you can get an understanding of why this doesn't work. You might be tempted to say, well, we don't know anything about Maharanga before the fight with Sukuna, which is true, but A, it's not a character, it's a tool, it's a different situation, and B, Megumi does mention it as early as chapter 9, so him summoning it here is more of a payoff to something he's mentioned at the start. The big thing that makes this fight okay is that the intent of the fight matters. From the outset, Sukuna establishes very clearly that the point of this fight is for him to just trial run a later thing he has in mind. It's Sukuna figuring out what he can do, figuring out what Maharanga can do, and how he's going to use it later and to what capacity. I've clowned on Gege for not setting things up properly, but this is when he is setting things up properly. He realized that this is going to be relevant later, so he needed to establish what the stakes are now. He did think about this ahead of time. That way, when we come back to this in 100 or so chapters, it feels earned, as opposed to the Dabura fight, where the entire fate of the story hinges on this one interaction. And it erodes the verisimilitude of the world because we've introduced an existential threat to the already existing existential threat. So the big bad is so far removed from any scale of the protagonist that we have been following that there's no way anybody can do anything about it. Thus, you don't care about any of these characters anymore. We have not spent enough time with the main cast to feel like they've grown or changed or even really a great idea of what they can do. So what's going to happen, and you can tell because this happens in chapter 17, is that Gege is just going to have to pull a bunch of hijinks out of his ass to figure out how he's going to power scale correctly. So now any sense of like organic growth or world building just isn't going to exist, or Yuji's going to come back. He's been mentioned a few times. It sounds like a Chekhov's gun, which just means that every single individual in this story has no point. And we've bred a new generation of bums. The characters the part JJK survives on are uninteresting. There are too many of them, and their designs are not all that unique, except for Dabura and some, if not really all, the Sumerians. The main trio/quadruplet of this story is bad. I understand the ideas Gege is going for in his writing of having parallel sets of siblings who are from different cultures but have similar issues with how they can talk to each other and relate with one another, but those ideas kind of just get put way into the background after the first few chapters when we introduce them. They're also handled with no grace. The dialogue is cliche and direct in your face, telling you exactly what this story is supposed to be about, which is an overarching issue I've already mentioned. And you would think that these are meant to be the main characters, but they surprisingly spend very little time either on screen or with each other to develop with each other or, think about each other in any way. After the 5th or so chapter, these guys are split up and then we have the time skip, so even less actual development or exploration of who these people are happens. Beyond just making fun of them, I do truly think that we should not have had Yuka and Suguri be in the story, or at least not the main focus. Their character relationships and the characters themselves are not interesting in any real way. Maru and Cross, because they're literally meant to be parallels, are just a more interesting version of the same story because they're on starker extremes, which also for me means that I think we should have just focused more on the Cimmerians. The Remelian tribe and their refugee issues are compelling and interesting from a baseline point of view, that if we just didn't split time with these two kids that I do not care about, this story would be more interesting because we would have more time to say things that are actually meaningful. Not talking about characters anymore, but Gege is constantly forced to stop all momentum in his story and solve an issue he left unsolved in JJK because now he realizes that there are ramifications to his actions. Gege definitely had themes in mind for this story because he handles them with all the subtlety of a brick. The guy has to stop everything he is doing to explain to you that he is writing a story about xenophobia and Japan's unique geopolitical situation as a global superpower that is still held prisoner to the United States after World War II. The scene where they discuss the gender roles in Jujutsu society and Cimmerian society is groan-worthy because it seems to be hinting that the Cimmerians are lying about the role of women in their society to better integrate with humans, which could be an interesting idea because it highlights how sexism in a modern society is engineered and an illogical concept while exploiting the patriarchal beliefs for their benefit. But we just inject this conversation in with no subtlety or nuance into the middle of a fishing trip and immediately move on so it hits you and then dips, only to be relevant in this one scene where it's meant to be a reveal that the spaceship was made by Maru and Cross and it's all part of this conspiracy thing. But I am so sorry, that's supposed to be a reveal? Their power is to control matter. We have seen this, we know this. When I first saw the spaceship form, I just assumed that's what was happening. And once again, the information doesn't matter. We have no idea how Mule works, so the reveal that it's a different kind of mule means nothing to us. All this is to say is that every writing issue this man has had is here, but worse, and the areas of discernible improvement from JJK are not there because of how the focus of the work has shifted. I don't want to spend too much time on the art, so I'm just interjecting this real quick. You've seen all the panels I've shown from JJK, and you've seen all the panels I've shown from Modulo. I think it's obvious that JJK just has a better panel flow and way of communicating information versus Modulo just not having any of the sauce. Even when we get to the fight with Maharaga, it just looks good of high fidelity, but it doesn't communicate information and really have the same power in the page that Gege did. Everything is too clean. None of the rough grittiness that I praised about JJK is here at all. Maybe once we get to the Maharaga and the Maru Suguri fight, it gets a little more messy, but it just feels so detached. I have no idea where the story's gonna go, because initially I thought he was trying to run away from a lot of his issues by setting the story so far in the future, but as we've gone on, more and more has been tied back to the events of JJK in ways I do like, for something like how Tokyo's being handled, but also in ways I don't, like Yuji still being around and doing stuff. So we'll have to see how it all plays out. I want to believe that Gege can write something good, and given that we're only halfway through, who knows? I just think so far it's all over the place. And more than anything, he just seems to be trying to do way too much for such a short runtime. A lot of the issues I've complained about, I wouldn't say are issues, but given that we're more than halfway through the story, I just don't see how he can feasibly act upon any of this, unless maybe he has another sequel series down the line, but then that means that this series itself won't be satisfactory. So no matter what, I just don't think we're going to get a fully realized story that is fleshed out all the way through, because there are just too many characters and ideas going on, and the writing isn't there to back it up. This is the last thing I'm recording for the video, and I just noticed it while playing this video back. But when I've been making this video, I've been using about 5 to 10 seconds for a panel and a page whenever I've been showing them on screen, because I think that gives you enough time to roughly understand what's going on. I've been doing that for Modulo, and you cannot read half these pages and panels. Gege overwrites so much that if I were to try and make sure that you intuitively understood what was going on, I would have to put some of these pages on screen for like 30 seconds. Where does that leave us? I don't know, man. I've spent so much of the runtime of this video explaining exactly why JJK fails in a myriad of ways, but truth be told, this entire exercise has gotten me to enjoy JJK in a lot more aspects than I did before. I can identify now why I value the work. It's mostly the characters and themes at play, but now I have a far better understanding of where the art comes in to accentuate the writing. And I'm telling you, that's not just the Stockholm Syndrome of spending over 100 hours on this video and engaging with the series for 5 years, but more than anything, I want people to actually think about what they are reading. Not to stand on a soapbox, but I think so much anime content on YouTube sucks because everybody treats anime like an esoteric medium because it's from the land of the rising sun, and obviously different from Western media, but it's not. It's just another form of art. There are some really good anime tubers out there, but I hope people can engage with work critically, like they would any other piece of art. Most of this is just media analysis because that's what my background is and what I can bring to the table. And I hope that if you're not familiar with media analysis, you can at least see the points I've made as worth interrogating. You do not need to agree with my opinions, but you need to agree that there are opinions to be discussed. When I was workshopping some of the ideas for this video with a friend of mine, I did the whole Toto clap page turn thing, and that opened his eyes, and then he was able to start pointing out other things in the manga where Gege was able to use art, panel, and flow in interesting ways. Thus, I was having a deeper understanding of the work, and he was having a deeper understanding of the work. And that's all I'm here for. If you take away anything, it's to think. By discussing JJK, you will love it more. By discussing Chainsaw Man, One Piece, so on and so forth, your life will be enriched. Because everyone and their grandma has seen JJK, discussion on it can be hard because most people have no idea what they are talking about. So maybe you should. Because the worst that happens is that you get lobotomized and irrationally become obsessed with Gege Akutami. Also, this video is Hikari propaganda, folks. Hikari's my goat. That's my boy. Gege, why'd you do so dirty, Gege? Huh? Gege.
She felt funny.